In 1955, Harlan Sanders was 65 years old, broke, and living out of his car. His income had narrowed to a $105 Social Security check. The man who would become Colonel Sanders had no chain of restaurants, no corporate office, and no comfortable retirement waiting for him. He had a vehicle, a pressure cooker, a seasoning recipe, and bills that did not care about his age. The collapse had not arrived from nowhere. Sanders had moved through a lifetime of unstable work, including jobs as a steamboat pilot, a railroad fireman, and a gas station operator. He had known stretches of progress, then watched them disappear. By 1955, the familiar promise that experience would eventually produce security had failed him completely. His age was no longer an asset in the eyes of most employers. It was another locked door. The car became his room, his office, and his storage space. A Social Security check could keep a person moving, but it could not create a business. Every mile consumed fuel. Every night brought the same hard question: how long could a man survive by carrying his entire future in the passenger seat? There was no dramatic rescue. There was only the recipe and the decision to put it in front of strangers. Sanders did not begin by selling restaurants a famous brand. He tried to sell them a method. His chicken seasoning could help a restaurant produce a consistent meal, while his pressure cooking process could make the work faster than traditional frying. The offer was simple in theory: use his approach and pay him a small return when the chicken sold. In practice, it required owners to trust an exhausted older salesman with no visible power. That meant driving from town to town and walking through restaurant doors alone. He had to find owners, wait for their attention, explain the process, and accept their judgment. He was not presenting a polished corporation. He was presenting himself after failure with a recipe as his only leverage. Each rejection carried a practical consequence. It meant more fuel spent, more time without income, and another night unsure of what came next. The humiliation was not abstract. An elderly man starting again could be dismissed before the food was even tasted. Restaurant owners already had routines, suppliers, and risks of their own. Sanders was asking them to change a working kitchen for an unproven system. Some said no because they did not need him. Others could reject the proposal simply because he looked like a man past his useful years. Yet the work contained a narrow opening. He did not need every restaurant to agree. He needed one owner willing to test the method, then another willing to notice the result. That changed the task from building a national company to surviving one conversation at a time. The scale was small enough to endure, even when the road felt endless. The first meaningful break came in Salt Lake City, where Sanders met Pete Harmon. Harmon was a restaurant owner, not a distant investor looking for a story. He had a real kitchen, real customers, and a reason to question any new idea. For Sanders, the meeting mattered because it placed the recipe inside an operating restaurant where speed, consistency, and customer response could expose whether the method worked. Harmon became the crucial test. Sanders' seasoning and cooking process were no longer confined to his own claims. They had to function under pressure, with employees handling the food and customers deciding whether they wanted it again. A business can survive a persuasive pitch for one afternoon. It cannot survive a method that fails during ordinary service. The kitchen would make the judgment. That test created a form of proof Sanders had never possessed while sleeping in his car. The recipe could travel beyond him. The process could be taught. A restaurant owner could use it without hiring Sanders to stand beside every stove. This was the turning point, but not a miracle. It was a shift in leverage. The product began speaking through the restaurant instead of relying only on the salesman. The name Colonel had already become part of Sanders' public identity, earned through Kentucky recognition rather than military rank. But a title could not pay for gasoline, and a white suit could not erase poverty. What mattered was that the title helped make the recipe memorable, while the method gave the title economic weight. Reputation opened attention. Repeatable work had to keep it. From there, Sanders kept moving. The road remained the business. He approached restaurant owners across the country, carrying his instructions and his persistence from one establishment to the next. The process was repetitive, cold, and lonely. He was not launching with a large staff or a protected budget. He was extending a small proof, one agreement at a time, while the consequences of failure still sat in the car. The public image of KFC would later make the journey look clean and inevitable. The reality was a long negotiation between scarcity and possibility. Sanders had to persuade owners that his method could improve their kitchens, persuade customers through the food itself, and persuade himself to keep entering places where rejection was the most likely outcome. Persistence here was not optimism. It was continued action under bad odds. At roughly 1,000 restaurants, the scale of the effort became impossible to confuse with a hobby. The number represented doors, miles, explanations, and refusals. It also represented a system beginning to spread without Sanders personally cooking every plate. His role changed from operator to instructor and promoter. He was building something that could move through other people's businesses, which is how a recipe became a network. That network did not erase the years behind it. The empty space where security should have been remained part of the story. Sanders had no guarantee that the next agreement would hold, no promise the customers would remain interested, and no protection from the ordinary risks of food service. What changed was not the disappearance of uncertainty, it was the creation of a structure capable of carrying him forward. The structure depended on standardization. A secret blend alone was not enough. Restaurant owners needed to know what to use, how to prepare the chicken, and how to reproduce the result. Sanders's value came from turning personal know-how into a process other kitchens could follow. That was the gritty mechanics of the comeback. Convert experience into instructions, instructions into consistency, and consistency into a reason for another owner to say yes. His earlier failures also became usable material. Work on riverboats, railroads, gas stations, and restaurants had exposed him to machinery, customers, timing, and the pressure of making a living from practical service. None of those jobs produced the future he wanted, but they left behind skills that could be assembled later. A broken career is not automatically a foundation. Sanders had to recognize which fragments could still do work. There was no clean emotional victory when the business began to grow. Starting over at 65 meant feeling the physical cost of travel and the social cost of being underestimated. He was building while carrying evidence that life could take everything back. That fear did not make the achievement less real. It made each agreement more demanding because progress had to be protected before it could be celebrated. The connection with Pete Harmon mattered because it transformed a private recipe into a public business model. Salt Lake City became the place where Sanders' idea met a partner capable of putting it into practice. From there, the method could be repeated by others. The crucial breakthrough was not simply that someone liked the chicken, it was that someone could help prove the process belonged in more than one kitchen. That is how KFC emerged from a man going broke, not from a sudden flash of genius. Sanders had a recipe, but recipes do not build companies by themselves. He had to travel, pitch, teach, endure rejection, and keep his costs low enough to reach the next door. He had to turn a personal technique into a dependable exchange between himself and restaurant owners. The legend often begins with the white suit and the familiar face. The harder truth begins with the car, the $105 check, and a 65-year-old man confronting a future that offered no mercy. His resurgence was built in increments too small to look heroic at the time. One meeting, one kitchen, one working agreement, one more mile. By the time the name KFC carried national weight, the original crisis had been transformed into operating knowledge. Sanders understood that survival required more than refusing to quit. It required finding a useful method, proving it in someone else's environment, and creating a way for other people to repeat it. That is the difference between endurance and recovery. Endurance keeps a person moving. Recovery makes the movement compound. Colonel Sanders did not defeat failure by pretending it had never happened. He built after it, with the memory of poverty still close enough to touch. The road did not become easier because he was ready. It became productive because he kept converting rejection into information and experience into a system. At 65, broke and sleeping in his car, he was not finished. He was finally working with the one thing failure had not taken, a method he could carry through the next door.